So ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Jarno Elorita, Robert Anderson, and Roger Shin, the main DITA-OT toolkit developers.
So this is where we usually talk about plans that are coming and let all of y'all, yes, all of y'all, ask as many questions as you want. And if I could put in a request, it would be that you space your questions so that somebody in the front asks, then the back, then the front, then the back, so that George gets a little more exercise after that.
Yeah, so I lost about 15 kilograms, so that's
all thanks to these Q&As.
Yeah.
So thank you for coming. This is the 6th event, and I really can't believe that we've had 6 of these. It's quite flattering that all of you are interested in hearing us talk about stuff. I don't know that we have too much left to say at this point. A lot of the things that we usually cover in these closing sessions, we've covered in past closing sessions, and you can just go watch those, and it seems kind of silly to say the same thing over again. So I guess we could talk a little bit about what we're expecting for the future, the next few months or year or release or whatever. And maybe I'll hand over to Jarno to start off with that.
Okay. Thank you. So as I already said, I am planning to introduce the support for multiple input files because the current design doesn't really work, I think. It will likely be something where you specify a single input file, but then you're able to add additional resources, like -- resource type of things, which would be like key maps or subject schemes and so forth. That'll be interesting to implement, and if we use a new sort of keyword in the command line tool, like -- resource, we can probably make that backwards compatible with everything else. We'll have to see whether that will affect anything that your plugins will do, or whether your plugins will just start magically consuming content that has additional information available to it, like if you're converting a single topic and suddenly, as if magic, you had the key definitions available to you. That's something that I think would be good to have. I mentioned the project that doesn't save any time, the one that allows you to hook things into the integration process. I might still try to do that. Maybe my measurements were wrong. Maybe I was measuring the wrong things, and actually it is faster. But it's basically, I think I've discussed it in previous years. It's a process where during pre-processing we generalize all the XML elements to match the root type, meaning task body will have the class attribute for task body, but suddenly the element name is just body. And that will allow us to rewrite all our XSLTs automatically to search for body element instead of just searching for asterisk. And that will allow Saxon to hopefully be faster. The problem is that we're not talking to Michael Kay, the developer of Saxon. We're not in contact with him, so they might be actually doing something that's making the processing faster, and we just don't know about it. They've added some, I think, toggles to Saxon to make it faster, but that's the problem when you have multiple parties not talking to each other. It's never a technical problem, it's always a human problem.
I think there was a session at the XML Prague when it was a Michael or somebody else from Saxon presented on different optimizations, and some of them are related to the DITA-OT processing.
Yeah, I watched that presentation, and I was hopeful. But there are other things that actually we could do to make it faster, if only we knew how to do those. I'm not sure what other things I will be working on other than we probably have to start to work on DITA 2.0 support. Not by removing support for copy to and saying tough, we're a 2.0 processor now, but rather adding features that you guys have been, or you people have been adding in the TC, like the ability to include things in topics without using conref and so forth. That'll be interesting to implement.
Yeah, we do have several things coming for DITA 2.0, which is still a little ways out, but the toolkit, we try to implement some of those ahead of time, which is part of the spec process, getting implementations out there to prove something is doable before it can be approved. And yeah, in a perfect world, every topic we'd look at, we'd say, oh, this is a 1.x topic, and it would go through the code that exists, and oh, this is 2.0, so it goes through the new code. That's probably not the most efficient way to do things, and probably not the best way to do things, even if logically it seems straightforward. So probably try to make things that are compatible with both, so we can reuse the processing, and maybe if we have something that is better in 2.0, then we can quietly under the covers convert your 1.x content to use the new structure and then use all of our new code, and everybody will be excited. Well, no, you won't, because you won't know we're doing that, but we will be excited that we are doing that with your content. Yeah, so we've got several things to do there. I'm not sure what else. Oh, I forgot to say when I started this, following Radu's presentation, I just wanted to say, Radu, you're clearly not busy enough, so if you could help with some of this, that might, sorry. That was a joke, in case it doesn't come across. Roger, do you have anything to add? Do you have any big docs plans?
This is the moment where I should say yes. But much like with the toolkit code itself, the docs is, I would say, in a way, a kind of a mature project. We've done some bigger let's change everything moves over the last couple of years. I don't anticipate any of those soonish, unless someone comes along that has some big ideas that they'd like to help us implement. Those are always welcome. Some of the suggestions that you heard today from Leif, I think are very good, and based on your response to those suggestions, those are things we might consider doing. Those are things that affect the website. Some things affect the docs. One area of effort and innovation perhaps would be surfacing some of the metadata that Leif has provided now in the form of index entries, and thinking about ways to make that more visible in HTML output. I snuck a last-minute feature request into DITA-OT 3.4, which my fellow project maintainers graciously accepted, because I sent a pull request, that should make it easier for us in the future to do something with index terms. I'm not sure how many people are aware of this, but there is a parameter in the toolkit that allows you to display index terms in your HTML output, like right on the page. How many people are aware that that exists? Cool. Okay, good. Of the one person in the back of the room that raised their hand, how many of you have ever actually used that? Yeah, see, that one hand stayed down. Why? Because for some reason, the ability to present those index terms on the page was coupled with a hideous magenta local style override. So that if you choose to show index terms on your pages, they will appear in a really ugly pink box. And I'm guessing now without asking Robert in advance, but he'll correct me if I'm wrong. I assume that that was done years and years ago as a sort of debugging output so that authors could maybe see what their index terms look like, or see which ones are associated with a page, but make them so hideously ugly that no one could overlook them, and that we would remember to turn that off before actually publishing. Safe guess? Safe guess. Okay. So the idea was that, of course, with local style attributes, it's very difficult to override that and make them look different. So we got rid of the local style attributes and moved that into CSS, which means that we can style them differently. And styling them differently isn't the only thing you'd want to do to present index terms in a sensible way on an HTML page, but it's a prerequisite for that. So that'll require more effort. But I could see us doing something like that, and all of the various web help systems that are out there have their own ways of presenting index terms or an index, an alphabetical index in HTML output. So that's something to think about. Maybe some ideas there. Some of the search things that we discussed today might be something to work on the website. And from various conversations we've had today, a number of you have expressed some confusion at certain things, like I've read the docs, but I still don't understand how X works. These conversations are very valuable to us as a project, because sometimes we don't know what people find difficult. So even if I've seemed maybe a little bit hurried or stressed today, and it looked like I wanted to stop talking to you and go get a cup of coffee, I was listening if you told me something like that. And I do take notes on days like this, and I sit in the airplane and try to write down all the things that people told me on the way home. So I can't promise that that'll all appear miraculously next week, but your feedback is very helpful, because one of the things about working on something like this is when we just talk to ourselves, it's really kind of hard to know what to do. So I think it's probably safe for me to say this, that all three of us probably draw a lot of inspiration from the conversations that we have here, and that gives us ideas about what to do. So thanks for that feedback. Another hand went up in the back.
The DITA-Open Toolkit is also used by a lot of people for whom English is not the first language, and not all of them are as strong in English as many of the people in this room. But they are used to coding in English. And what I find wonderful about many of the docs in Oxygen is that even when things are well documented, maybe from their point of view, and I don't understand, that there's usually a code example. And when you're writing plugins and you're looking for how to interject your build step, your new build step between post-processing and pre-processing and this step, there's no examples in the code. You guys describe really well, but then it's like, So really I encourage anytime somebody is, looking for how to help people with the docs, to add something that a hacker could take, even if they speak, Swedish or French or whatever, and look at and adapt to their particular, this is an example of inserting a build step. So
I do think that some of those are maybe obscure by design, at least a few of the pre-process extension points, because I know at least a couple of us up on the table don't really encourage people to use certain ones. I'm trying to be a little vague here, because basically, we've talked in the past at DITA-OT days about how the pre-process is kind of a black box. And originally, you could add something in between every single step. And there were extension points everywhere. And that made it hard to change, as we talked about earlier with the technical debt. You merge two steps, and that disappears an extension point. And so, at least my preference, and what I encourage others to do, is to try as much as you can, stick your extensions at the end of pre-processing. That's not always possible. Sometimes it's not the right thing to do. Sometimes you can't edit what you need at that point. But I don't know if we have examples of ones that go right at the end. I think we should.
I can give you an example of end and beginning. The end before I knew that there was in fact, this is like a 10-year-old plugin almost. It's something that creates images from math for the PDF processing and then inserts them back into the doc. So that's a post-processing step that goes and inserts them into the stage 3 FO, I think. And then the beginning is actually, we have 70,000 files, and to use the default pre-processing for the DITA-Open Toolkit does not build by Delta, and the build would take an enormously long time. So we overtake the genlist step, and we use C code with a graph to only generate the files that have changed or that inherit information from a file that's changed.
Wow.
In any case, I do think that wherever you're putting your new target, it would really help to have code examples. Actually, of anything that you're documenting, we're all kind of hackers. So, and sometimes linguistically explaining things won't make sense to somebody who's kind of in that mode.
So I actually tend to disagree. We're not all hackers.
Well.
Very few of us are hackers. That's why we have more end-user documentation than developer documentation. And I don't see, well, plugin development, where do you draw the line between just customizing and then being the hacker developer? So we don't actually have almost any developer documentation. That's not by design, that's just because in order for us to produce that, I would probably need to live with Roger for a couple of years, so we'd be able to create that information in written form. Or he could just sort of open my head and pick my brains, but that's creepy.
Or we could put cameras around Jarno, but he also finds that creepy, so.
So it's unfortunate that we don't have any developer documentation. I don't know if people actually need that, because from my perspective, we only have 2 people who would need that information, and we're already here. So, and if people want to join in actually developing OT, they're really quiet about it. If the reason why someone's not contributing at code level is lack of developer documentation, then it's unfortunate that that's the reason. But usually hackers will just come in and start doing things even without the documentation.
I just wanted to follow up. I can go, if that makes sense, if you know what I'm going to ask you. It's a follow-up with what she said.
Oh,
actually, the developer documentation would not really be for the lone hacker that came to the project. I had this situation with developers in my former company, Java developers, and I told them, can you help me on something? And they took a look at the project, and there was no documentation for them. And they said, can you explain to me a little bit? And I said, no, I am not a Java developer. So when you're a sponsor internally and you have access to someone who's nice enough to develop something for you, it's a big step up for this guy. So you cannot go to your developers internally and say, please learn the whole code base of this project just to help me do a little thing. So I think the developer documentation would be useful for the non-developers to introduce the project to developers in their company, for example. That's my opinion of the thing, because nobody's going to just stumble upon the DITA-Open Toolkit and start developing for fun. It's too niche, I think. But you may want to be able to introduce the project.
So, chicken and an egg problem.
Yes.
If we don't produce developer documentation, we will not get developers. Over the last 10 years, we've noticed we're not getting any developers from anywhere because no one's interested. If we were a project that had some other things that would make people want to do this, we probably have more reasons to document it. And then, of course, the problem is that we have very few people who would be able to document it. Basically, the two of us, and we just don't take time. I mean, if it's okay for you that we'll take a year off from everything and just develop a documentation for Java coders, that's one. But I'm personally unlikely to start that process. So in a way, the only thing I can offer you is sorry.
Actually,
Wait, Leif, before you start. Because we've been talking a lot about this the last couple of minutes, I just feel obliged to point out that I studied art in college. I'm not a developer. Says the woman who requested the developer documentation, who apparently also studied art in college. Excellent. So maybe you and me need to write some developer docs. I don't know. But what I'm saying is sometimes I can only produce the things that I myself understand, and by virtue of sitting next to these two gentlemen on the table, you may be overestimating my abilities. There are parts of the toolkit that I understand well because I've used them, but I cannot write certain levels of developer documentation. I don't do Java development or any of that kind of stuff. So those of you that are capable of doing that and see a gap, you're very, very welcome to step up and contribute. And speaking of stepping up and contribute, I'd like to give a little shout out to Ursula, who has done that in the last couple of days. She's been struggling with this new thing, and she does lots of documentation and developer documentation herself for other projects, and she has opened my eyes a little bit to some of the gaps. So I'd just like to say thank you to everyone who spends your time with this thing and stumbles over something and tells us about it. And Ursula had the mic for a moment before it went back to Lionel, and that's why I'd like to ask Leif to bring it up to her so that she can ask her question before Leif asks his.
I don't actually have a question. It's about this conversation specifically, and it's to extend exactly what you just said, which is this is an open source community, which requires community involvement and making pull requests to the project. So if somebody's missing something and they know how to add it, make a pull request. It'll almost certainly get added.
Okay, add me as a reviewer. Forgive me for my sloppy use of the word hacker. I just meant somebody who's a maintenance programmer who kind of is an autodidact, who's learned on their own. In any case, I think there's a lovely article that's still on the internet that's 20 years old called How to Foil the Maintenance Programmer. And it starts off by, you imagine the maintenance programmer, he's looking at your code through a roll of toilet paper. And that's basically, I would love to contribute to the documentation, but the developer docs for me aren't thorough. Like I touch the toolkit every 3 years and then I go, oh my God, how do I insert a new like a new trans type or something? Like what am I doing? And I refigure it out every 3 years. And I have no idea if what I'm doing is, there's not enough documentation for me to know if I'm following the, So how do I send you my code examples? Like for all I know, okay, it happens to work, but it's not the way to do things.
Well, one of the things we've talked about is having a separate section that's basically tutorials. I mean, I've written some tutorials like that are on my blog, which are extremely silly and should never go in our docs. And also not all that findable because they're not. But yeah, maybe a tutorial section, and I think that's probably a better place to put some of this, how to customize kind of stuff, because one page on how to insert one specific extension and do one ANT target probably isn't all that helpful, because it would get very repetitive trying to do that for everyone, and what you really want is a process start to finish of doing it. And so that's where I think it would be really nice if our docs have like an example of inserting a step at the end of post-process. That's something that is a common way to customize, straightforward. I don't know if we have that or not. But yeah, in terms of more extensive developer documentation, like Jarno said, it's basically the two of us to write that up and Roger to then edit it and make it friendly and usable and all that. And that's the development team. That's every person on the development team taking up every part of their time for a certain amount of time work on that. And yeah, it's a matter of resources and time.
Just in case someone misunderstood, when I said developer documentation, I didn't mean plugin development. For me, that's not development, that's plugin configuration. So when I talk about developer documentation, I talk about hacking the core, I can't pronounce R's. Sorry, and not naughty bird. I'm really bad pirate. So that's actually been one of the problems with defining our sort of user groups, because we have two pirates, meaning the people who hack the core, again the R, and then we have plugin developers who, from my perspective, are not developing OT, they're just building customizations, and then we have the end users. So for me, developer documentation is the raw Java code, not plugins.
And our docs don't have anything about that.
Yeah,
we do try to customize the plugin. Right?
We don't touch the Java code.
Yeah.
No, we remove GenList, and we have another process that intercedes that at that point and creates basically what GenList would be creating, but in a different way. So we're interceding, but it's different. It's not the Java code. We don't touch the core. So it's a plugin, but it's a pretty heavy-duty one.
Yeah, it sounds a little scary to me. As someone who has done something very similar in the past, and basically taken over GenList and tried to create my own lists, and then as the toolkit moved on, and that's not something that's like a public API, and the file lists change, and some of them go away, and now everything's moved into the job file.
I'm not telling everybody to try this at home.
Yeah, no, so that seems certainly for me to cross that line somewhere between ordinary plugin and hacking or developing. I'm not sure I want an example of that in the docs.
Okay, so I think it was Ruby on Rails who has this convention that, because you might not be able to protect some part of the code from being accessed or modified, but they have a convention. If it's documented, then it's public. If there's no documentation for something that you can modify, then it's private. We're forced to use ANT, so everything's effectively public. We're forced to use, or we can use XSLT, which again means everything can be written over. Yeah, and in a way, it seems that we're following the same approach, that if it's not documented, then it's private. We apparently just didn't tell anyone. But okay, the real reason is we haven't had time or resources or skill to document something, because even though I'm able to write some code, I'm unable to document things because I'm very bad at writing or describing things in an understandable way.
Actually, for XSLT, there in XSLT 3.0, I think, there is the XSL package.
So all George wants us to do is upgrade thousands and thousands of lines to XSLT 3, yes?
Yeah, but you will have the XSL package that will allow you to kind of have
but then we will break backwards compatibility for everyone in every case.
Yeah.
And then we would decide which things are private and which are public, and we would make everything private because it would sort of be easier for us. But some people might find that unfortunate.
Yeah, having gone this long with XSLT, where effectively everything is public, you know, any decision to make something private is potentially a breaking change for someone.
With regard to private versus public, maybe there's one other factor at play here, and that is perhaps that some of our documentation may be more private than is clear to us, in the sense that in various stages in the project we have reorganized the sort of top-level structure of the documentation. We had years ago a structure that distinguished at the top level something called the user's guide and something called a developer reference. And a while back, I believe it was around the 3.0 era, we decided that that distinction was a bit arbitrary and a bit antiquated with a sort of book-like metaphor. And we felt that that was sort of asking people to self-select, am I a user or am I a developer? And so we abandoned that hierarchy in favor of a slightly more sort of merged list of topics that didn't rely so much on that book metaphor. One of the casualties, I think, from that information architecture review and reorganization was the visibility of some of the topics that previously existed in the developer reference. They're buried a little bit deeper in the hierarchy now. And that's one thing that makes me a little sort of sad in a way. And on the other hand, maybe there's a quick fix there in the sense that I sometimes hear feedback about if only the docs explained X. And I know that they do. And so in some cases, I think it may be just a matter of making some of that information more visible. Topics about how to insert a new ant target in a pipeline or, things like that, adding a new transformation type. I've heard people today ask me, can you explain how to do that in the docs? And in some cases we do, and it may be that those topics aren't being found, and that's something that we can probably improve. Perhaps those topics don't answer the questions that people have about these things, so we can improve them a little bit. But I think that's one thing that we'll need to look at is in cases where we do describe those things and people aren't aware that we have described them, how can we make that information more visible to people? And that's something we can probably do more easily than write an awful lot of new content. So I'm always, sort of quick to see what low-hanging fruit we can find that will immediately make things better for people. But if you have found a topic and it doesn't explain what you thought it should, that's an area where we could use some feedback and some input. Thanks.
Okay, so may I ask a question? Is there anybody that has, I really need something that does not exist in DITA-OT, like if you had a chance, this is the feature that I'm dying for, this is the feature that I really want for the DITA-OT and it's not yet there, what that will be?
They already know. A way to build a delta. A way to build a delta. That's.
George, did we talk about incremental builds? Was it yesterday or the day before?
I think we talked about that also last year. Yeah. I just ran the idea by you, and then we talked about this yesterday.
Yeah. We keep talking about it.
Yeah. No. Actually, we talked when we discussed about the DITA-OT day this year, like when we had a meeting, I think, and we were saying like something interesting would be incremental builds.
They would be really interesting, and it would be a really wonderful thing to implement. Most things in world can be fixed with money. Yeah, well, and the other one is most things in world could be sort of made to happen with violence, but we're not going to go there because violence is an awful thing. If you have a company that has money, or you have just money lying around, get the developer to implement that and then send a pull request, and it probably will be then merged.
Ideally, a slightly different process, get a developer who talks to us and implements it, and then the pull request is much more likely to go in. We've had, not often, but we've had a couple of cases where we've gotten pull requests for massive changes that we had no awareness of before they came in, and the coding doesn't fit at all with the code style of the toolkit, or they do things that we look at like this this won't work for certain reasons, and the person would generally go away unhappy because this massive change wasn't accepted. We've only had that a couple of times. But if somebody comes to us and says, I want to work on incremental builds, what should I do, or can you help me, and throw around ideas and things like that, we would love to do that. We have the meetings every month where we have anybody who wants to can call in, and that's the kind of thing we would talk about there. If there are plans, whenever Jarno's planning a big new feature, we usually talk about it in those meetings and get feedback, and that would be great.
Yeah, so in a way, don't throw money at it, throw warm bodies at it. So get us those developers.
Yeah, it's hard to feed money directly into the toolkit, and no matter how much you hit it, it's not going to give you incremental builds. So yeah, a developer would be the best, which gets into the usual conversation we have every year about the number of developers up here right now, and every year we warn about that and talk about all the uncertainty, and yeah, just go back and look at last year's panel and the year before, and we talk about it and things don't change and we're still here, and probably don't need to go into it again. But that's sort of where it comes down to for a lot of these features. There aren't many of us implementing it, and there are a lot of things we'd love to do or love to help do.
And of course, the same applies to documentation. So get people.
I just wondered whether sponsored development would make any sense, in the sense that since the people that work on the project work on it nights and weekends, if Jarno were able to do this during his day job because someone out there works at a company for whom it isn't important enough that something lands in the toolkit that they could pay Jarno to do this during his day job through his employer. I don't know if that's an option, but
I see that as sort of, well, it's a money problem. If you're used to getting something for free, you're really happy that you're getting it for free. But then when you have to start thinking it in terms of it's 100 euros an hour and it'll take 2 months to implement, then you start to think, maybe I'll just run it for longer. Even though many people would get the same benefit. I think we are trying to solve the problem that many open source projects are faced with. Warm bodies.
I'm not sure if you're aware, but maybe you're not, if you've been talking about incremental builds as magic, but there's this tool called Bazel, B-A-Z-E-L, which is, it's basically about caching previous builds.
Okay, so there are...
So like you could like just use that. I mean,
programmers have one joke. So there are two typical things in software development.
Naming things.
Cache invalidation and off by one errors. So that's the joke. It's actually quite funny.
It is, yes.
It's the only joke that programmers
I've heard it.
have. So
that's why I'm not laughing.
Cache invalidation is quite difficult to do without it being expensive. Because the only reason why we want incremental builds is we want to save time effectively. What we could do is just save the results from the previous run, run it again, and then see what changed. But that's expensive. You just want to do the minimum amount of work. And that's where it gets sort of difficult to do it fast.
Okay, it was just first thing that came to mind.
So everybody then it's...
Did anybody find this worthwhile? Like this day? Oh.
No, Mikko. Nope. Doesn't anyone have a single thing they want except incremental builds? Because we have a mature product. We don't have to develop it anymore because it's there, it works, and as long as there's a JVM in the world, it will work. So in that sense, we don't have to develop it anymore, but you sort of have a sort of possibility to now highlight the things that you absolutely must have, otherwise you'll be unhappy.
That's true. In my slides earlier, it's like, you have the chance to talk to us. This is really great for us, despite how tired we might seem, and despite the fact that we all may be headed for hibernation in a couple of hours. Yes?
More helpful error messages.
More helpful error messages.
Yep. That's a tag team effort, I think. I've heard that several times. And to my great embarrassment, I must admit that when I'm not working on DITA-OT stuff, people sometimes pay me to work as a copywriter. And I have not yet, since I have been on the project, sat down and done a copywriting pass on the error messages in the toolkit. So some of it is about the understandability and the sort of quality of the explanations in those error messages. So that's one bit of low-hanging fruit that we could probably address. A number of those things aren't copy issues, but things like, do we have the information to present to the user? So we know that sometimes the toolkit sort of says, something went wrong, and there are some error message where it says, this thing went wrong on line 48 of this file. And I think it's fair to say that over recent versions we have increased the ratio of error messages that provide that location information and say your problem is here. So that's certainly helpful. But I think we can do better at that. So maybe we can think about that together in a future call, is how can we improve the quality of messages overall. One last thing. And I saw something else today that reminded me that sometimes it's not only our error messages. It's things that appear to come from the toolkit, but may actually be coming from something like ANT. And I hadn't seen this for a long time, but today someone showed me a problem on their machine, and it was the dreaded unable to locate tools jar. Yeah. And no one knows what that means, because tools jar isn't really missing. And so, yeah, you're right, we can do better there. I'm not sure how quickly and how easily, but point taken.
For my internal customers, we've added an info message right at the start of every build that says, ignore any message about tools.jar. And I still get questions about tools.jar. So yeah, a quick couple things building on what Roger said. First off, increasing the ratio of error messages with those details, he doesn't mean we're increasing your error messages. Just want to make sure that's out there. Also, in this latest release, there was a pull request from somebody not in this room, somebody new to us, that corrected a typo in an error message. So technically, I think we just did what you wanted. We improved the error messages.
Fun fact, if you disable debug information, the build will be faster, but your error messages will be worse.
Not only are we making George go back and forth, he has to do a dance step around the camera.
I work with someone who's under 30 years old. And she finds, she's starting, so I'm trying to teach her, but I'm also trying to make her autonomous. So I showed her our user group lists and OT users, and she calls us very old school. And one of those reasons is like the mailing list. It's old mailing list, right? So it works by thread, it works by, and it's not searchable, and it's, so if she has an issue on a version that she Googles it, but it's a smaller community, so it's not like Stack Overflow where you'd find a lot of answers. For me, it's usually easy to find because I'm used to I'm used to the keywords, but for her, it's harder, and I think, yeah, so I don't know if there's another way to put those messages and add a search engine. It's not an OT directly, but you might get fewer repetition on the same questions that someone had 6 months ago.
Yeah.
It's secondary, but...
No, good point. I mean, our user community is a bit fragmented in that sense. I mean, we have, 10, 15 years, I think, of history on the DITA users list. and many of you in the room got an email this morning saying that the list has shut down and it's now available at groups.io. So, you know, people are aware that the loss of that list would be a big loss for the community because there's so many years of knowledge there, but we're also aware it's not a super good, you know, searchable database of stuff. And that's not strictly just DITA-OT, it's data stuff, and it's all kind of mixed up. And so, you know, there were questions about how to retain that list. Should it move to something more chat-based, forum-based, something like Discourse or something like that? But a lot of those products require money. And, you know, it costs something to migrate 15 years worth of archives into a new system. We use, to coordinate our development efforts, a Slack team, and that many of you are a member of, and of course that's a good way to get a hold of us for some quick ad hoc questions. But that is also something that we're on the free plan. So we have 10,000 messages of history there, and the more active we get, the less retention we have, of course, because if we talk a lot in 1 month, then the number of messages that disappear into the archive, you know, get larger. There's the Write the Docs community that has a DITA channel. The question came up there, like, yeah, I hear Yahoo Groups is dying. Why don't they just all come over here and talk? And the problem is that there are 70,000 people, or 7,000 people, I think, in that group. And so 10,000 messages there lasts about a month. So, you know, some of the tools that we use, we're on free plans where, you know, we only have a limited history and that kind of stuff. So I'm not sure how to go about solving that, because there is no single, this is the definitive forum for all things DITA and DITA-OT. And, you know, maybe there's a company out there that wants to, you know, get a sponsor for the community some sort of solution to that problem, but that hasn't emerged yet, and I don't really know an easy way to do it. So.
And even there, the problem is that, you know, we've for at least 10 years, we've had people saying Yahoo Groups was too old school, we should be on something new. And the problem was always, there's so much history, and, you know, it started before DITA was a standard. It goes all the way back to when this was just a beta project. And if we get somebody to pay for a service, even if we're able to migrate all of that, you know, a vendor steps up this year and pays for it, and next year they decide it's not cost effective and we lose our archive. And so DITA users moved to someplace, and Chris Eberlein stepped up to pay herself for the one-time migration, because you could pay and migrate and then move to the free plan if needed. And that's safer. But I also should point out, DITA users is not our thing. You know, it predates DITA Open Toolkit. It covers far more than DITA Open Toolkit. We've made attempts in the past to start groups for purely DITA-OT discussion, and they have a tiny bit of activity. Some of them still exist, but for the most part, DITA users was there. It was the most popular spot, and so people went there. And we'll see now that it's had to move if anything changes.
And it's also sort of because we have very limited time to support the community by hand-holding. So we sort of rely on community supporting itself. And we sort of occasionally think about alternatives to the current ones. We never come up with anything that's free and it work. And most of our users are over 40. No, sorry, 30. Maybe people are over 40. So they're happy with emails. There are people who would definitely not use anything other than email because it would be just way too difficult. So in a way, there you could just throw money, buy us this course for 10 years, and we're happy. If you buy it for 1 year, we'll probably go, will it come back to next year? So.
And like you mentioned, the Slack plan, you know, I looked into it once and I thought, well, how much would it cost to pay for this? And then I realized that it charges by the number of users in your team, which is not helpful for a open source project that has a lot of lurkers and a growing number of lurkers who just, you know, follow discussion. And every time someone joins up just to see what we're working on, the cost goes up. And that's not something that we can manage. So instead, we get discussions like, hey, where were all those numbers about our issue tracking and all the graphs that we made? Oh, Slack got rid of them. And earlier today, I sent Lionel a message, and as I opened up the direct message, I see the little thing at the top that basically says, ha ha, you've got older messages, we're not showing you, pay to see them. And yeah, kind of stuck. Any other questions, comments? What time are we at? Oof.
All of this sounds really gloomy. George or Radu, could you do something that would end on a happy note without maybe dancing, but still, but like.
I have something for a happy note. I have said this several years in a row, that this event is kind of a highlight of my year because it's fun to come and meet everybody. And I really was serious on the slides earlier. Like, you have the chance to talk to us and ask for things. We're hearing some things, certainly. And it's great to hear all of this. And at least two of us up here are very much introverts by nature, and hopefully we didn't seem unapproachable because we are approachable here. And as soon as we leave here, we will have to recover and hibernate for a while, which means all these things we've talked about doing, you're probably not going to see them in the next month. But yeah, thank you all for coming. This really is great to have so many people come to hear us every year.
Yeah, so I really want to thank you, because without, you all coming to this event, this would not be really possible. Also, without you, we'll be just having a hackathon or something rather than an event like this. I want to thank...
We would not have a long enough hackathon to come up with the incremental build, so please don't plan on that. When he shows up and we're stuck doing incremental builds, not going to happen.
I also want to thank again to our supporters, so Comtex from the organizers of the DITA Europe and the DITA North America conferences and other DITA related events. I would like to encourage you maybe next time, it's really worth to attend both events. They bring a lot of value, and some of the sessions, as you've seen, Roger also presented that some of the DITA-OT projects development at the DITA Europe. My session on context was also there, so they kind of complement each other. Miramo, they develop, as I said, a customized plugin that allows you to get a nice PDF with a visual designer. Ixiasoft, that are supporters for this event for a long, I don't know for how many years, almost every edition. And I would also like to thank to my colleagues from Synchrosoft for allowing us to have this event every year. And I would like to remind you that we gave you some feedback forms, and that is very useful for us. So if you can fill in put some words there, that's really useful for us. We compile that feedback and we share that with Jarno, with Robert, with Roger. So it's really useful for us to understand what you liked, what you didn't like, if you get value out of this event. Does it make sense for you? Because that's really useful.
And everybody should thank George, because I think this was his idea originally 5 years ago, the first one. And, 5 years before the first one, and then the sixth one now.
Yeah.
I guess, yeah, we held the first one 5 years ago. And yeah, this was George's idea, and we were all a little surprised, and then we were more surprised when it happened again and again. Thank you, George.
Thank you. Sometimes I just come with the idea, I know, and I find some people that help to. And sometimes I do, but sometimes I get also help, so that's good. So thank you all, and hopefully we'll see you next year. Bye.